Our opening words today are from Michael Eric Dyson, who authored the book, What Truth Sounds Like, Robert Kennedy, James Baldwin, and Our Unfinished Conversation About Race in America. And quoting Michael Dyson, he says, Martin Luther King Jr. was a man of faith who didn't mind making trouble for God. He believed his purpose in life was to bring justice to as many of God's children as possible, while proclaiming the revolutionary power of belief. And that wasn't a mere metaphor. He believed that America must undergo a revolution of values so that it might begin to fulfill the mandate of the gospel, to look after those who needed God's help the most. And Michael Dyson quotes Martin Luther King Jr. from his sermon entitled The Drum Major Instinct. And Dr. King says, God didn't call America to do what she's doing in the world now. God has a way of even putting nations in their place. The God that I worship has a way of saying, don't play with me. America, in its present incarnation, with its present leadership, teeters toward an arrogance, isolationism, and self-importance that are the portals of moral decline and political self-destruction. The nation must recall the faith of Martin Luther King Jr. He saw faith as a tool for change, a constant source of inspiration to remake the world in the just and redemptive image of God. On this holy day, instead of shrinking into the safety of faith, we should, as Dr. King did, bear the burdens of the less fortunate and rise again to serve humanity.
We are building a new way. We are building a new way. We are building a new way, feeling stronger every day. We are building a new way. We can feed on every need. Every need. We can feed on every need. Every need. We can feed our every need. Start with love, that is the seed. We can feed on every need. Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our cry. Without these, our world will die. Peace and freedom is our cry. We are building a new way. We are building a new way. We are building a new way, feeling stronger every day.
Good morning. I am Michael, and I will serve as your worship associate today. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist of Central Delaware Sunday service. We continue to be grateful for the technology that allows us to continue to meet during these times of social physical distancing. Thank you for your patience and grace when we have technical glitches or delays. Consider them, if you will, invitations to take a deep breath. In addition to our worship each Sunday at 10, we meet on Tuesday nights at 7 for a more informal time of check-in and sharing. Please consider joining us for that gathering, and for all of our connections, we encourage you to invite a friend to join and get to know our UUCD community. There is certainly room in our hearts and our space for more people who are searching for a liberal, diverse, non-judgmental spiritual community. Now, I invite you to take a deep breath and listen to these sincere words of welcome. Whoever you are, whomever you love, wherever you've been, whatever you've done, whatever your religious beliefs are or aren't, and wherever you physically are on the planet right now, you are welcome in this spiritual community. However you move in this world, how much or how little is in your bank account or wallet, however you are feeling at this moment, you and all of us who you are welcome in the spiritual community. We are all enhanced by being together.
We'll be lighting the chalice this morning, reminding ourselves that Unitarian Universalists around the globe light chalices in communion with us. These are the words of Unitarian Universalist Association, UUA, Leadership Council, toward a vision for Unitarian Universalism in a multicultural world. With humility and courage born of our history, we are called as Unitarian Universalists to build the beloved community where all souls are welcome as blessings and the human family lives whole and reconciled. With this vision in our hearts and minds, we light our chalice. And now please join me in our unison affirmation. The words are in the chat box. Love is the spirit of this church and service its law. This is our great covenant to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
Welcome, friends. It's Gisa from Butterfly Garden. I have a story for you today, and it's called We March by Shane W. Evans. The morning is quiet. The sun rises, and we prepare to march. We pray for strength. We work together. We come from all over to march. We follow our leaders. We walk together. We sing We are hot and tired, but we are filled with hope. We lean on each other. As we march to justice, to freedom, to our dreams. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. The author writes, on August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people gathered in our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. to participate in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The march began at the Washington Monument and ended with a rally at the Lincoln Memorial, where iconic musicians such as Mahalia Jackson, Bob Dylan, and Joan Baez performed, and Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his historic I Have a Dream speech. Throughout history, there have been many organized marches where people walked together to advance a common goal. The Selma to Montgomery March, which consisted of 3 separate marches that took place in March of 1965, was held to focus attention on the civil rights movement and the need for outlawing racial discrimination. The routes are now memorialized as the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights Trail. Following these marches, the country enacted 2 pieces of legislation that were crucial for moving the country toward racial equality. The first was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned racial segregation in public schools, public places, and in select workplaces. The second was the National Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed discriminatory voting practices that denied many African Americans the right to vote. It takes people of all ages and cultural backgrounds to move a nation into the new era of freedom. In a sense, these marches pushed old ideas out of the way and moved new ideas forward. History shows that where there is change, there will often be resistance to change. However, these events demonstrate that through action and determination, people have the power to overcome that resistance. I have always been inspired by the idea of people coming together, joining hands in prayer, lifting their voices in song, and marching toward freedom.
This is the part of our service where we talk about the UUA, and we bring up an issue or something current about the UUA that we want everybody to know about. But today, we have a special guest as our speaker, and she's been to our church before. She's visited with us, Paula Cole-Jones. And I'm going to talk about her a little bit in this reading, UUA reading. That's what she's going to speak with us later. On the 8th principle, where did this come from originally? Paula Cole-Jones, Director of Racial and Social Justice for UUA, developed the idea of the existence of 2 different paradigms in UU circles, UU 7 principles and beloved community, deep multiculturalism. After working with congregations on these issues for over 15 years, she realized that a person can believe there being a good UU and following the 7 principles without thinking about or dealing with racism and other oppressions at the systemic level. Evidence: most UU congregations are primarily European American in membership, culture, especially music, and leadership, even when located near diverse communities. She realized that an 8th principle was needed to correct this, and talked with Bruce Pollock Johnson about some of the components that should be in it. Bruce's congregation, the UU Church of the Restoration in Philadelphia, incorporated it into their covenant at that time. Then in May 2017, formally adopted it for themselves and recommended that the UUA adopt it. For people identified as white, it is too easy to ignore these issues, which is exactly what keeps the system of racism in our society alive, and in fact, worsening right now. We need to decenter whiteness and other dominant cultures in UUism. The eighth principle came from a feeling that we need something to renew our commitment to this work, to hold ourselves accountable, and to fulfill the potential of our existing principles.
It's now our time of joys and concerns when we offer one another the opportunity to share very briefly what is most in our hearts right now, life's celebrations and concerns. As you do so, we invite you to light a candle in your own space. Through the action of sharing and kindling a flame, we give energy to our best thoughts, meditations, sympathies, celebrations, and prayers. We hold these as sacred in our collective hearts. At this time, we invite you to change your view to gallery view in the upper right corner of your screen so you can see everyone who's here. As you feel led, please unmute your microphone and share your joy and concern and light your candle if you have one. You can watch the mute signals on the lower left of each person's video stream to see if anyone else is unmuted. It's best if we share one at a time, and then please mute your mic after you've shared. I light this final candle for the joys and concerns that were not spoken by those of us here, and in solidarity with others in our community who could not be with us today.
A central part of our worship in person and online is the opportunity we all have to practice the art of generosity. Our gifts to UUCD are what allows this congregation to thrive with a common vision to nurture our spirits, build community, and change the world. We are grateful to you for the many ways you support our community, including your financial pledges and offerings. Your gifts truly translate into lives changed. Every part of our ministry, from the worship that grounds us in our values, to the community gatherings that connect us, to our children's education, to our social justice outreach and actions, are supported by your gifts. We are entering this new church year with gratitude for the ways we have stayed connected in this past year, with enthusiasm for new opportunities to live out our mission, and with great hope that we will find innovative ways to work and worship together in the coming year. Your giving makes all of these things possible. For those who are making pledges or who want to contribute to this community, you may continue to write checks and mail them to us, or you can give online. There are instructions to do both of these things on our website at uucd.org. Just click Support UUCD on the menu bar. You can do that now, during this offering song, or at any time that's convenient.
We'll
Our centering reading is an excerpt of a speech delivered by Ibram X. Kendi at UC Berkeley on September 12th, 2019. These are his words: racist or anti-racist. Ironically, Americans who self-identify as not racist, whether they're conservatives, moderates, liberals, radicals, progressives, they don't realize that we are connecting ourselves to a history of slave traders who self-identified as not racist, although they didn't use that term. We're connecting ourselves to enslavers who said, yes, when we say Black people should be enslaved, when we say slavery is a positive good, when we say slavery is a necessary evil, or that Black people are the cursed descendants of Ham, those are not racist ideas. That's God's law. That's science's law. That's nature. That's logic. We don't realize we're connecting to Jim Crow segregationists who said, I'm not racist. It's separate but equal down here. You can't tell it's separate but equal. We're following the law. We're not racist. We're connecting to eugenicists who were really the first group of Americans to be classified as racist, who also turned around and said, this is science. This isn't racism. This is science. We have empirical data to demonstrate that Black people are intellectually inferior by nature. Just look at their test scores. And today we have white nationalists. We have white supremacists who self-identify as not racist. We have white supremacists who, before they go into a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, write a manifesto claiming that Latinx immigrants are invading Texas, then also claiming, I'm not racist. We have this long history of racists classifying themselves as not racist. Racists who cannot imagine that they have been reinforcing notions there's something wrong with a particular racial group. Racists who can't imagine that the policies and policymakers they're supporting are creating and reproducing racial inequity. Fundamentally, racism, its heartbeat, has always been denial. The sound of that heartbeat has always been, I'm not racist. To be more specific, the sound of that heartbeat has always been not racist. And so in writing How to Be an Anti-Racist, I've had one singular goal. If I could somehow shape the world, what I hope would come out of this book is very simply, we would eradicate the term not racist from the American vocabulary. Then it would force people to recognize that they're either what? Racist or anti-racist. It would force Americans to recognize that all policies are either racist or anti-racist. All ideas are either racist or anti-racist. Then we can truly have an accounting of ourselves, of our ideas, of our policies, and of our country. Because at some point, we are going to have to stop denying that we have metastatic racism. Because if you didn't already know, it is literally killing America. It is literally killing this world. The three lethal weapons that are threatening American existence and human existence are, of course, nuclear war, climate change, and bigotry.
It's good to be here with you today. We are just 24 days into a new year, 2021, and already volumes of history have been recorded. It's a time like no other time that I've seen in my life. There are times when we need a bird's eye view to make sense of all that is happening around us, to make sense of the particular moment in which we find ourselves, because it might feel like we're having new experiences when we may actually be in a long experience where some things need to be brought to conclusion in fulfillment of overdue aspirations and promises. So I'm going to reach back 55 years for words of wisdom that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave to us when he addressed Unitarian Universalists as the Ware lecturer at our 1966 General Assembly. These are his words. One of the great misfortunes of history is that all too many individuals and institutions find themselves in a great period of change, yet fail to achieve the new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands. There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution. And there can be no denying or contradiction of the fact that a social revolution is taking place in our world today. As many of you know, Dr. King had a relationship with Unitarian Universalism. He knew us. At times he attended a Unitarian Universalist church in Boston, where the association president, Reverend Dana Greeley, served as minister. In his speech, Dr. King affirmed our work and he gave us marching orders. Now that was 55 years ago. Of all the work that we do, addressing and eliminating oppression is central to who we are. If we are to build the beloved community, we must learn to recognize the systemic and the subtle ways that oppression works to shape our relationships and to diminish people's value. Dr. King spoke of segregation as evil. And although segregation was to end with legislation, today we see how the attitudes and practices that supported segregation continue to support voter suppression, mass incarceration, police brutality, and the killings of unarmed people of color, the abuse of immigrants, and a myriad of injustices, right on up to this month, where the whole world witnessed an insurrection in an attempt to overthrow the national election and to overthrow government with an intent of doing harm to elected officials. This was an organized effort to deny democracy and one of our most basic civil rights, the right to vote. Noam Chomsky said that, quote, democracy is a threat to power systems, end quote. The day after this month's insurrection, the president of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker, made this claim even more relevant when he said, and I quote, white supremacy is the greatest threat to democracy, and democracy is the greatest threat to white supremacy, end quote. This, he says, is the cause of the crisis in America. We have unequal, unjust systems that teeter on our acceptance of systemic racism and oppression. At times, the manifestations are so subtle that they can escape notice by many people. And sometimes they are so blatant that they defy any reasoning or any rationalizing to make them go away. The evil of segregation that Dr. King spoke of and fought against was just one expression of a larger system of white supremacy. White supremacy is an evil that was normalized in this country's history and never fully addressed or eradicated. And now we all see it, and it is a threat to this country. So evil, how do we talk about it? How do we as Unitarian Universalists relate to evil? It is said that Unitarian Universalists do not have a theology of evil. And in light of what we are watching unfold in our country, I'm calling this claim of no theology of evil into question. So let me step back for a moment and provide some perspective on how I see evil through a contemporary lens. About 5 years ago, I had a personal experience. I don't have time to elaborate on it now, but I had a personal experience that made me just stop and pay attention. And it led me to a clear belief of the power of collective positive intention and action. This is not a revolutionary idea, but it can have revolutionary results. We watch it in practice all the time. And I began to wonder, how can we galvanize more of this power in our Unitarian Universalist ministries? So it was on the forefront of my mind. Then 4 years ago, trying to figure out how to live in a society that was becoming more hostile, it was apparent that just as I believe in the power of collective positive intention and action, I must also reckon with its opposite. Now, I don't believe in evil as a supernatural demon or devil, but we have long been confronting the power of collective negative intention and action. This is what our social justice movements are about. Collective power taking on another source of power that is doing harm to the community. Unitarian Universalists are driven by the call to social justice. It is central to our values and to our identity. We have a history of confronting the forces of injustice. Now, we might not use the language of evil, but I think that when we confront injustice, we are putting our theology into action. And in there is a theology of evil that we express by our actions, but not by our words. Why not? It helps to name things. When I first spoke about this 4 years ago, it was because we were not prepared for what was to come our way. And quite frankly, it was far worse than even I thought it would be. It is time that we name the power of collective negative intention and action and develop that theology of evil. It matters, not only to us, but to the world, whether or not there are people with collective negative intentions and actions running or threatening this country and its institutions. We need to understand the spiritual and structural forces that are at play, both with the collective negative intentions and actions and with collective positive intentions and actions. If we understand that, we can harness more of the positive. We can't be passive about it and assume that it's not happening. We need to be actively engaged in practices that fulfill our principles and respect the inherent worth and dignity of all people and communities. The eighth principle is a spiritual calling for us to pay attention and to develop ongoing practices of dismantling racism and oppression. This is how we can fulfill our role in building strong communities around justice and inclusion, something that needs to be affirmed far and wide in an emerging or re-emerging culture of white nationalism and authoritarianism. This eighth principle keeps us relevant to the world in which we live in today. And we can't want so much for things to be okay that we avoid seeing the work that needs to be done to make them okay for all of us. No one is finished with this work. No one is finished with this work. People who are most negatively impacted by discrimination and injustice in its many forms have been saying for years what needs to be changed. That's why we march and rally to raise the level of awareness of injustices that are deeply affecting our communities. That is why the labor movements grew around economic justice. Civil rights grew around racial justice. The women's movements, the Stonewall for the LGBT rights, and that's why we have Pride today. It's why we had Standing Rock and the recent student movement, March for Our Lives, the call for gun control, 99% movement, Black Lives Matter movement, and more. People have been telling us, they keep telling us, that it is time for social change. It is important to see these calls from the community and these movements from the perspective of collective positive intention and action versus collective negative intention and action. Not enough has moved yet. Every time we challenge injustices and call for changes in the structures that perpetuate injustice, we ourselves are saved. Now, I grew up as a Unitarian Universalist, and I identify as an agnostic humanist. And when I say that we are saved, it is because when someone else receives justice, a piece of our own humanity is restored too. And the world actualized has a greater sense of peace and the unfolding of human potential. Justice matters to our own faith formation and our development as human beings. And we often hear about the gap between our aspirations and our lived reality. So the eighth principle calls us into practice in that gap, living our Unitarian Universalist values more fully. And rather than feeling that our work as individuals has been done, the eighth principle opens up a whole new realm of what there is to do. And it is in this new realm where our spiritual awakening and the revival of Unitarian Universalism can take place. The eighth principle helps to build a bridge between now and what is possible for us in light of the beloved community that we talk about. Now, this idea may sound abstract in general. The eighth principle is still young. It can be difficult to explain. The latest congregation just adopted it last Sunday in Princeton, New Jersey. So we're finally at a point where there are congregations that can give us an idea of the benefits of having an eighth principle as part of the spiritual journey. Now, this is not to say that the eighth principle, that what it calls us to do is new. It's not. What is new is centering it in all that we do, and not just treating this work of justice and inclusion as a social justice project in a larger church environment where everything stays the same. We have been talking about transformation for years. It has been somewhat elusive because many people have a hard time imagining what would be different. Now imagine for a moment that I am not here alone speaking with you, and that I am a part of the eighth principle learning community, and that there are other voices here in the room. And although they can't be here in person, I want to share with you what some of the ministers and people of color in our movement are beginning to experience. These are quotations from the ministers, where these quotations are from a December discussion that we had in the eighth principle learning community, and the people of color are quotations from a January session that we had. Reverend Fitzgerald from Honolulu said, quote, "Some of my colleagues have said that they wish that Unitarian Universalism would come into its fullness of valuing all lives, but it hasn't. The eighth principle is an important theological statement that brings in beloved community and anti-oppression language, with a result as we talk about accountability and being in action. It's been a blessing to ministry to see how congregants are incorporating it in the ways that they are beginning to think and act. Eighth principle must be owned by the congregation. Ministers embody and proclaim the good news of the eighth principle, but it must be owned by the congregation. He also said, if you want to attract people under 40, you should probably adopt the eighth principle. This is what people are talking about. It is what they want to see in their lives, end quote. Reverend Crestwell from Maryland said, quote, "World has changed. This is the dawning of a new age of consciousness, and we see it in our children. White supremacy has become overt. People of color are not just making this up. We all know it now. After the pandemic and this administration, the previous administration, Unitarian Universalism is essentially behind. Where does that leave those of us who haven't even gotten to the eighth principle yet? The Unitarian Universalism that will thrive in this new age is going to be anti-racist. We've been waiting for this. It is just like the world woke up. The change has already happened, and we have to catch up," end quote. Reverend Tanner from New Jersey said, quote, "Hearing my daughter's voice centers it all for me. We don't have any time to waste. We don't have another generation of children who are expendable, and we can't live as if we do. Come from a long lineage of heretics. And what heresy are we called to now? What are we called to proclaim? I think we should be doing everything we can to not only dismantle racism, but to think about reconciliation and what are we moving toward." And Reverend McKinley from Pennsylvania said, "We are seeing an increase in the enjoyment and services. If we think about this as the blank slate, how would we reimagine our community to have an eighth principle lens in everything that we do? What would our community look like on the other side of this pandemic? This includes not just diversity of people, diversity in theological materials and music styles, If it is the norm, then diversity is what we will all have in common. There's no roadmap for us to figure this out, and that's okay, end quote. Those are some pretty strong testimonies from ministers who are now on this journey with their congregations. Then we asked people of color, what difference would the eighth principle make for them as Unitarian Universalists? This is what some of them said. Ellison from Honolulu said, quote, makes a huge difference. If we're not going to deal with the eighth principle, then everything else that you tell me about the seven principles is not ringing true. If I were to consider moving from Hawaii, I would be looking for a UU church that has the eighth principle, because otherwise it's just too hard, end quote. And Dorian from the Baltimore Church in Maryland said, quote, I knew intuitively that I was loved in my congregation, but for them to adopt the eighth principle was a tangible expression of that love. Not only did they adopt the eighth principle, but they immediately began doing the work. It has given me a brand new congregation that I feel a part of, and it is my congregation. It has been magic for me, end quote. And Lutricia from North Carolina said, I am a Unitarian Universalist because I really do believe in the principles and I try to live them. And the UU Church is where I have the best chance to do that. The eighth principle is hard work. If we were really practicing it, it would be transformative and it would change our relationship, not only to ourselves, to our congregations, and to our communities. I see the possibility, but it is not just a sweet little thing that we can do that is loving. I am not sure we have developed the muscle that we need to make the eighth principle real and transformative. But I think if we did that work, it would change our reality in terms of how we see our world and how we live in it, end quote. Dr. King spoke to us 55 years ago, and our own people are speaking to us now at a time when this country needs and hopefully is about to undergo a deep transformation. Our work of the liberal progressive church, is to build strong, inclusive communities and to join in with communities that are using the power of their collective, positive intention and action to help heal the wrongs and to correct some of the historic structures that perpetuate inequity and suffering. Work is far from over. And given the way that this year began, we know a sense of urgency. Given the beginning of a new administration, we breathe a sigh of relief, and hopefully we will move forward with renewed commitment and faith, not sleep through this important time of social change, to do our work and to intentionally bend the arc of justice. For us, the eighth principle becomes even more significant because it is about how we will hold ourselves accountable for being people and churches free of the perpetual evils of historic injustices. And I close with these words from Dr. King's Don't Sleep Through the Revolution speech. Quote, the great question is, what do we do when we find ourselves in such a period? Certainly, the church has a great responsibility because when the church is true to its nature, it stands as a moral guardian of the community and of society. It has always been the role of the church broaden horizons, to change the status quo. End quote. Let us journey towards spiritual wholeness by building multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and oppression in ourselves and in our institutions. May it be so. Amen.
Please join me in distinguishing our chalice. The word should be in the chat box. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Our closing words come from Burroughs Dunham in a book he wrote in 1947 called Man Against Myth. Now, therefore, since the struggle deepens, since evil abides and good does not yet prosper, let us gather what strength we have, what confidence and valor, that our small victories may end in triumph, and the world awaited be a world attained.
I can see him in the distance.